Okay, I'll kick it off.
Okay.
Right, welcome everybody to the Atrium presentations on this fine Wellington day. Fine, cold Wellington day. So today, Becky's going to be talking to us about where do we dance? And it's going to be really interesting because where do we dance? After 5 weeks in level 4 and 3 weeks in level 3 and starting into level 2 very soon, where do we dance? So Becky's going to talk about her, some of the early sort of research and findings from exactly that, where do we dance? Because space can have kind of a join it together effect. Anyway, I'll leave it over to Becky to take it away.
Cool, thank you, Regan. I'll just share my screen. Cool, so yeah, I thought I would, and I've had to put this together very quickly due to a last minute deletion in the program. So maybe it's kind of more of a conversation. But this is a bit of research that I've been doing with Dr. Vokia Abrahamsa, who's a environmental psychologist up the hill, and it's called Where Do We Dance? And I think the reason I got interested in the work was because before I came back to New Zealand in 2015, I was living in China, and I just was really enamored by the fact that if you walk outside at dusk, you see a whole lot of people congregated on the corners of streets dancing. Someone's got their kind of ghetto blaster, to use the words of the 1980s, and kind of, everyone's just gathered around dancing. And then you go along to I lived in a place called Suzhou, which is famous for its gardens, and you would go into the gardens and you would see mostly men, I have to say, gathered around playing a type of Chinese chess. And you would see this everywhere, and the streets were sort of lively and full of people. And this is not obviously peculiar to China, but I just really loved that kind of being amongst it, even though I didn't really know what was going on. Before that, I lived in the UK, and I was just always surprised by the fact that whenever it was a little bit sunny, people would flock to the commons and put on their bikinis and Speedos, despite there being no water to speak of to swim in around, and they would sunbathe and there's sort of varying levels of social interaction, but they would sort of gather at least. And of course, there's this sort of institution of the pub, and the wicked man up the top right corner even kind of inhabits these places, and they really kind of have been at least sources of kind of opportunity for social interaction and community. You kind of know if you move into a place that you go to the local and you'll potentially meet up with someone. We went on a lovely holiday to Brittany once when I was living in the UK. And I don't know if anyone's ever been to Brittany in the summer, but they have these beautiful festivals called Fesnos, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, where you go along to the sort of centre of the village or the town, and everyone joins in doing sort of the dancing that you learned at least in New Zealand at intermediate school, like it's a bit like the sort of gay Gordons or those kinds of dances we had to learn as kids. And we went along to one of these with an Icelandic friend of mine, and you just pick it up. You join in and pick it up. They're easy, and there's wine, there's hot dogs. But the fascinating thing was there was older people, there was middle-aged people, and there were teenagers. And I was thinking, wow, you can get teenagers to hang out with their parents in the middle of a French kind of village. That's pretty remarkable. And then I came home actually for my interview when I interviewed for the job up the hill, and I was put in. It was November, and it was a rainy, windy Wellington day, and I was put in James Cook Hotel. That's where I stayed. It was a Sunday night, and I walked down to Lambton Quay, and I was the only person on the street, and I just remember feeling this sense of kind of that's right. New Zealand doesn't use its public realm very well, and so it just got me thinking, where do we make friends? Where do we build our community? And where do we dance? That was the sort of the shorthand, I guess, for all this. And just seeing my husband kind of arrive here, who's British, and just seeing that there's a real lack of opportunities for him to connect with people really outside of work and what have you. So just exploring the sort of spatial kind of consequence of our urban form, and whether there might be certain spatial things that either kind of encourage or discourage that interconnection. So drawing off Ray Oldenburg's work, which many of you will know about, but he talks about this idea of third place. So our first place being our home or our domestic place, our second place being our work or productive space, and then the third place being, where community happens or where you make friends or whatever. And these are the kinds of characteristics that he talks about being important in third places. And some of these are potentially not relevant to New Zealand, that some of our research has found, but I think this sort of the basic ideas that he has there is really important. I won't go through them. So yeah, where are the project focused on where are our third places, and we focus particularly on suburbs because our suburbs are overwhelmingly domestic. So this scene is pretty common around the country, at least in terms of new development. You get a lot of suburban, as you all know, you get a lot of suburban morphology that looks like this, where we sort of drive into our garages and we, never have to say hello to our neighbours if we don't want to. And I think one of the problems, at least in this, sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, but one of the issues with our sort of very domestic suburbs is that I think our third place and our first place become the same thing. So when I've talked to people just in passing, where do you think your third place is, or where do you interact with people? They'll say things like, well, I invite people around to my house for a barbecue, and it'd be interesting to hear your guys' thoughts about what you think your third places are. And so I think in New Zealand we've got a whole lot of private space, so we're never forced into the public realm, but we also have so much private space that we're really able to invite people into our homes. Why is that problematic? If it will move on, I think there's 3 reasons why this is problematic in the broader scheme of things. The first is that we tend to only engage with people who are like us. So we pre-select, and we tend to not kind of, invite someone who has a different, way of doing things to our homes. So it really kind of dissuades mixing across communities. I think it potentially slows down community integration. At least that's been the experience of my husband here. And I think, that if there are no signals that there are third places available, sorry, that's supposed to be places, people don't seek them out. So, the example of the pub in Britain, there's a pub there, that's a third place. So you seek it out, you'll kind of come across someone who's local. I think, why is it not moving? So these were our questions. We were looking at, what are our third places? Where do we congregate? Does this differ by cultural group? So are there differences between Māori, non-Māori, refugee and migrant communities, that kind of thing? And what's the kind of physical aspect to all this? Is there a spatial, I don't want to go so far as to say spatial set of rules that encourage this, but of spatial kind of indications that might make it more possible to interact in our communities than less, perhaps. So we brought on a whole lot of master's thesis students, and they did a whole lot of different topics, and I'm just going to talk about one of their findings. But Chantal's thesis was really interesting, looking at shopping malls as a third place, and particularly Wainuiomata and Johnsonville, and really and found that they were actually really critical third places and community spaces, and that it's really problematic that we tend to kind of send these into private ownership when they're actually really important spaces for suburban centres. And then Emma was looking at multicultural interactions in Newtown. Elaine was talking about green spaces and whether the public benefit from them in central Wellington. I'll talk a little bit about Eleanor's work. So hers had a great title, "You Could Never Have a Third Place in a Sausage Factory," which was one of the quotes that she got from one of her child participants. And then Grace was doing a kind of general look at Oldenburg's work. So just focusing a little bit on Eleanor's stuff, what she did is she worked with a group of school children at Worcester Bay School in Miramar, and she worked with them to develop their own third places around the community as a way of, and she sort of did a before and after survey and interview to find out whether children were more likely to be independent in terms of their mobility, in terms of being able to get to school on their own or being allowed to go to the school on their own, if they had more agency over the place that they were creating. So she found that their decline in active travel of children's mobility was linked to social and spatial factors. So there's definitely kind of obviously a spatial component there. There are clear gender differences. So girls were less expected to be independent in their neighbourhood than boys. And having a role in suburban placemaking, i.e. kind of increasing agency, really, really mattered. And it did increase the number of times that children visited their neighbourhood, went out and explored and did things. And children were drawn to marginal and liminal spaces, so not the kind of fancy playgrounds that are often on offer, but the sort of leftover spaces and corners and behind trees and things. So that these kids created all sorts of interventions, shall we say, in the suburbs. So the child on the left has created what's called a fidget board, where people can go and fidget, and that was pretty successful. And on the right hand side was there are a couple of book libraries around the place. Children developed a teepee that kids could hide in from their family if they wanted to. There was a chess set, and a swing. There's a couple of tire swings. In fact, Vicky, you might notice this. This was down on in Ceto by the sea there. But I just love the story. There was a bit of land just beside Worcester Bay School. It was a grassy kind of verge, not for parking, but all the parents used to park their cars there when they were picking up the kids. And the teachers would put lots of, notices saying, don't park on the green verge, it's not parking space and it's unsafe, and so the kids erected a tire swing like this one here on that space, and they put up this sign, keep kids safe, no parking, and still parents continued to park on this verge. And so the kids decided to make their own parking tickets, and they put parking tickets on the cars that would park on the space, no more parking on the verge. So, if you give kids a bit of agency, they can really, change the world. So onto the survey. So Voki and I did a relatively large survey, just checking my time, survey last year. I'll just motor through this, and this is just me trying to pick out some key stuff from that, because we're still analysing the responses. But we looked at we sent out the survey to the whole of the Wellington region, and we got 512 responses, mostly, or big proportion were female, as you can see. Quite a reasonable spread of ages, which was pretty good. In terms of ethnicity, reasonable spread. We were quite keen to compare ethnicities. We've got about just over 10% Māori, I guess, which is a little bit low, but reasonable spread. And we asked about sexuality, and you might think, why would you ask about sexuality? And it's because I was talking to someone about this one day, and I said, where's your third place? And he said, because he arrived in the country sort of 5 years ago, I think, from Britain, and he said, actually, I'm gay, and I have felt like I had this ready-made community that I could connect into. And I thought that's fascinating. And in some ways, having a certain sexuality may even make it easier to connect into a community than if you're heterosexual. So we tried to draw out some of that in the survey. We wanted to find out whether people had children, and this is partly because some of the work that's gone on before by Karen Whitten and others up at Massey in Auckland found that children were really important for connecting with others, and they talked about how the school gate was often a third place, but it's really dodgy for someone to stand by the school gate if you don't have kids. So we thought we better ask, do people have kids? And surprisingly, actually, not that many people did in our survey. So we asked people how they first met people in their neighbourhood, and it's not kind of surprising, the responses here in the squares. I don't know if this is great, but the squares is, the largeness of the squares are showing the proportion of the response. But what I think is surprising is that people still did meet in the street, and I think sometimes we imagine that people don't use streets for that purpose these days, because it's all a bit scary and we're scared of strangers and things, but actually lots of people still meet in the street. So the street and the bus stop particularly were both really important moments for connection. Lots of people liked big spaces. So again, I sort of had this perception, and maybe it was just me, that people liked kind of intimate spaces for interaction. Of course, some people do, but a good number of people really did like, in the purple box, more than 50 people sized spaces. I can't see what this question is. Sorry. When do you usually visit the place? So I guess, the red and the red is once a week. So I was also really surprised by that people were very regularly kind of going to their sort of their places. And this one is the characteristics that described their place. Again, I was a bit surprised by the response, because I imagine that some people liked, or quite a few people would like, sort of structure and clubs, and Putnam's book Bowling Alone talks about the sort of demise of the club and how people really kind of hanker after that. But actually, if you see the orange box down the bottom, that said there are formal criteria for accessing the space. So very few people wanted that, and many more people wanted people to be able to come and go as they pleased. People from all walks of life are found there. There's no formal criteria for membership. So a very kind of open, kind of wanting all sorts of people to be able to access these spaces, which I thought was great. How do you get there? Again, most people really wanted or walked there. So having spaces in close proximity was hugely important. Strength of neighbourhood, they're basically half and half at each end. Half felt they belonged, half didn't feel much belonging. So implications for the way we do built environment, just to finish off. I guess just to sort of reinforce the fact that the street is a really important social space, and yet I think we neglect the street as a sort of design element when we're thinking about neighbourhoods, and we perhaps tend to focus our energies on kind of, particular spaces like, green spaces or parks or public squares or whatever. People do know their neighbours, so that's something to build on. Large spaces are liked, but obviously a variety is needed for a whole range of different kind of preferences. Favourite places are in our neighbourhoods, so we do like those, and we should be able to kind of get there by walking. So each neighbourhood needs third place candidates, and I think I live in Northland, which has 53 pizza shops and no kind of place to linger. And I think, there's a role in local government in ensuring that suburbs offer lingering third type places for people, and there's kind of nothing here except for the lovely Ahumairangi Hill up the road, and people are open to meeting people not like them. So most people want that. Most people want to meet people who aren't like them, but they just kind of need opportunities to be able to do that. And that's it. Cool. Let me stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Becky, and thanks for stepping in the breach. Because I'm sort of organising questions, I get the chance to ask one straight away. Do you think that we are losing the ability to dance or the options to dance?
Well, I guess it's interesting thinking about what happened when we're in lockdown and how people really did inhabit the streets in a way that we haven't seen very much, in our sort of day-to-day life. If you mean by ability the desire to, or do you mean options?
Well, for instance, we Zoom a lot now, so
right.
our the technology is actually getting in the way.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm a natural introvert, and so I'm quite happy to kind of hunker down and not. But actually, I think there comes a tipping point when you do find yourself needing some actual face-to-face interaction. I mean, we were just talking with Peter and others, and Victoria and others this morning about students wanting to meet face-to-face and have had enough of doing Zoom. So I do think even for us introverts, there's a tipping point at which we're like, okay, I've had enough now. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I was curious, just in terms of methodology, was there a certain response rate, what the response rate was, and how, you got such a high number of responses using Qualtrics? That's just from a curiosity standpoint about how you did this.
Yeah, we did use Qualtrics. That was our kind of way of doing it. But I was a bit disappointed with the response rate. I mean, we got 512 responses across Wellington. Most of those, we were hoping to be able to get a significant amount in each centre. So Hutt City, Wairarapa Upper, but we probably only got a significant amount or enough in Wellington City. We got a lot of responses in Wellington City. Do you mean how did we kind of get people to do the survey?
Did you mail out surveys? Did you have them go online and fill it out?
No, so that that's a we just did it online. So we're only going to get people who have internet. That was a what do you call it? A weakness, I guess.
Oh no, I wasn't quite a weakness. I was just curious.
No, we were kind of aware of that, but we just, in terms of time, we had to go for an online version. We used Neighbourly to advertise the survey. We used Facebook groups. I tried to join up to every single community Facebook group across the Wellington region and advertise the survey. Yeah, so mostly Neighbourly and Facebook groups. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Other questions?
question. One thing that we discovered in the lockdown was the amazing amount of public spaces in the Kelburn, Highbury, Northland area and public walks. And yet, of course, we're now being trained that you stay at least a metre away from people and don't breathe on them. Do you think that's going to have an impact on New Zealanders' use or desire for public spaces, the third spaces?
Well, I wonder, even though we're being trained to not breathe on people, I think the bigger kind of compulsion that I got a sense from just talking and hearing others speak about their situations was to be out and using the public realm. And I do think having now discovered these new public spaces, that people, I think we'll see a lot more people using them, and maybe it will drop off over time. But I do think for a good while we will see people making use of these new places. Yeah.
Because it's going to be an interesting change. New Zealanders tend, as you've found and demonstrated, not to move about except in large groups, the pubs and the nightclubs and the theatres and the concerts. And yet the local parks are designed for small groups.
Yeah, well, I think maybe we just notice the big groups, but actually there's a whole lot of small groups kind of, plotting around neighbourhoods and things. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I walk up this path, a few times a week up to the top of Ahumairangi, and there's I see at least 10 to 20 people most days. Many more people than I used to see, even now under kind of level 2. So yeah.
Thank you.
Last question for Becky.
Yeah, Becky, thanks for that. Just one small question to begin with. Do you have a list of the places that they considered favourite?
Yes.
Respondents?
Yeah.
Because I was just thinking, most of my stuff has to do with social use of space, and I tend to follow a kind of a assemblage model, which tends to look at the singularity of each place, and it tends to not look at finding generalised sets of things that you can put down as to say these are the things you should have or whatever. And so, but I was just listening, just you describing some of the characteristics that people gave as to why they went there, and I was thinking that would be really great to cross over between the two sort of methods. And to me, there's a lot of valuable stuff in there. So yeah, I don't know. I just thought I'd say that just as
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, at one stage we were thinking, should we almost be getting them to kind of geolocate their space or their favourite place or whatever on a map, but
you could do that. Haven't they already identified it somehow? Have they named it?
Well, they've identified it with words, so
But you could work out where it was.
I think mostly, and we haven't looked at that in detail. I've had a quick skim. I think I could mostly work out where it is. Some people have talked in general terms,
right?
But yeah, I'd have to look at the data a bit more closely.
Yeah,
but
we did once. We did a whole lot of quite ad hoc surveys of all sorts of people, both everyday people and people in organisations across Melbourne, and asked them about what was the most publicly significant place that they found. And it wasn't your favourite place. Okay. And so they were making assessments of what they thought was the most important place for the community around. And then we would get those and then trying to count for them in a kind of fairly casual way. But I found it really a really valuable thing to do, to actually see what specifically was the place and then go back to see why. What were the it wasn't just one factor, it was interacting factors that were responsible for it.
Well, the other thing that we are planning to do is that so a lot of people would identify. So, for example, one person said Vincent's art space, I think, on Willis Street, maybe. Anyway, somewhere around there. They wrote me this big whole email afterwards saying this is the best third place in the country or something. And I had a couple of other people, send me other emails. There was an interesting response saying that is it Mittens the cat? Is that famous cat? No, that's the one that's just been given the keys to the city. Anyway, that cat. Someone said, I think that cat is a third place, and it's like a mobile third place because people they will follow this cat, and they will meet up with other people following the cat, and they will take photos of the cat, and so it's kind of, and so I thought, wow, that's really interesting. So what we thought we'd do is kind of go back and interview key kind of spaces like this that people were just raving about, and try and find out the particularities of those.